Welcome to the You, Me, and BTC podcast. This is episode 25. Today, we're chatting with Edward Castronova, the author of Wildcat Currency, which is a new book about the history and future of all sorts of virtual currencies. In this exciting discussion, we'll talk about monetary regulation, how we can learn from virtual economies like those in massively multiplayer online games, and much, much more. We'll even mention J.R.R. Tolkien and why he said that humans need and love fantasy worlds. John was busy preparing for a show this week, so your hosts are just Tim Baker and myself, Daniel Brown. Here we go. I want to welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We have an awesome interview ready to go. We are sitting down right now with Mr. Edward Castronova. He wrote an awesome book that I just finished this morning. It's called Wildcat Currency, and we're going to talk all about it. Just to tell you a little bit about him, I'm going to read this little bit of a bio here that I have. He's a professor of telecommunications and cognitive science at Indiana University. He's a founder of scholarly online game studies and an expert on the societies of virtual worlds. He's appeared on 60 Minutes, and his work has been reviewed in the New York Times and The Economist. He gives keynotes at major conferences and consults for business. So, Mr. Castronova, we are really excited to have you. Thanks for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Dan. Very nice intro.
Thanks. Well, I didn't...
He says awesome a lot, doesn't he?
Yeah. Well, I feel awesome.
Well, you are awesome. Well, hey, first thing I want to know, the title of the book. You call it Wildcat Currency, which is an amazing concept in itself, but I want to hear it straight from you. What is Wildcat Currency?
Okay, so it goes back to like in the 1920s and also at other times earlier when people just went out to like Oklahoma and Texas. They'd heard that there was oil there. And they just walked out in people's yards, said, I'll give you, $10 for an acre of your land. Okay, here's the land. And they just started putting down oil wells. And if they struck oil, everybody would hear like, oh, there's oil over here. And they were called wildcatters. They just went out and did it. There wasn't any kind of regulatory environment. There wasn't any, oversight or anything like that. And they said, man, this makes sense to do. And so they just went and did it. And I think that's kind of what's happening in the crypto rush. There are all these people just kind of going, you know what, this makes sense. We've got the technology. We're going to do it. So that's the origin of the term. It's the idea of anybody and his brother can go out and make themselves a form of money if they want to.
I want to ask something. I know this question could probably take hours or I guess maybe even a whole book to answer, but just because in your book you talk about all kinds of things, everything from frequent flyer miles to Facebook credits and things like that. And in the podcast, we focus on Bitcoin and on crypto things. So I just want to know what, in a really, really general way, I know there's all kinds of things you could get into, but in a really general way, what do you think about the crypto movement? Do you like it? Do you think it's good or bad? Stuff like that.
I like it a lot, but I'm not a fan of any one particular currency that's out there right now. But but it's hard to say you like something when you know the history of money. I mean, there have been some very good things and some very bad things associated with different monetary institutions. And economists always focus on the idea, well, it's best to have one super efficient currency. But at the same time, economists say it's really good for markets to be free. And there's a trade-off there, because when you have one, super efficient currency, it's also a lot easier to burden that currency with, regulations and taxes. And that creates a lot of drag. So there's this tension between the need for human systems to be free and kind of evolve the direction they want to go, and the efficiency and, I'll just say it, social benefits of trying to regulate things and keep things orderly. So it really, whether or not this is good or bad, it depends on how you feel as a human being. Are you kind of, in terms of Dungeons and Dragons, are you more on the chaotic good side, or are you more on the lawful good side? That's what's really in play. And I really like the cryptocurrencies because they're bringing all that back. They're kind of making us understand that this is exactly what's in play.
Could you tell us, like, specifically about Bitcoin? What are some negatives that you see there as, like, just any negatives to that?
Well, first of all, I'll just say, when you say negatives, here's what I'm thinking. It's things that would prevent uptake, right? And we know that Bitcoin isn't owned by anybody, but, people are fans of it and want to see it or something like it take off. And I think the barriers right now are things like, people get scared about the swings in value against the dollar. Right? So there's speculation that goes on. And I think there's also this association of this whole area with crime, which I'm sure you guys know is unfortunate and is just a startup situation. But that's out there right now. Everybody associates it with Silk Road and things. And I think the third thing is there needs to be several layers of user experience improvement, right? Because you don't realize kind of how quickly things have to work before average people will use them. So Bitcoin is there's still some barriers to use. But some cryptocurrency is going to solve all three of those at some point, and then look out.
Yeah. So, do you think that I don't know how recent it is, but I guess it was a few months ago, the IRS decision, and they're deciding to treat Bitcoin like a property. Do you think that, in your opinion, that'll help with Bitcoin, with growing adoption, or what do you think will come out of that?
Well, I think, in the short run, any kind of government involvement is going to chill the Bitcoin market a little bit, right?
Yeah.
It's just the thing about government in general, and our government right now, is pretty haphazard. Like, it's hard to predict what exactly are you guys going to do? So there's the initial effect is chilling. So, but in the long run, it might be that just the mere recognition of Bitcoin as a thing is going to be helpful, right? I'm sure that a lot of people first heard about Bitcoins just from the mere fact that the government said there are Bitcoins, and blah, 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 blah. Nobody listened to the rest of it. But just like, oh, what? What is this thing? So I think, there's never an easy answer, but I think in this particular case, long run, having the government notice Bitcoin is going to help. And then the real question is, what are they actually going to do? Technically speaking, just speaking about the IRS also believes that it has the right to tax the transactions that go on at the Burning Man festival, right? Which is people go out in the desert and there's no money allowed, but they barter things, they trade stuff. And I understand that the IRS sent a guy out there to wander around, try and figure out how are we going to tax all this barter. People are trading their VW bus for, their 60-foot tall stilts. And the guy was out there for like a day. It was like, we can't do anything here. Forget this. So, so it's like on the books, but they're not going to do anything. I think Bitcoin is in the same position right now. They're like, okay, they've stated that, it's a barter and therefore taxation is created and blah, blah, blah. But let's see what they actually do.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about regulation and everything, what do you think about regulation? And with Bitcoin or with any form of currency, do you think it needs to be regulated? And if so, why? Does it need to be regulated for the currency's sake or for the user's sake? What do you think about regulation in general?
Well, I subscribe. I'm an economist, right? So first of all, I'm going to say that I subscribe to the notion of market failure. And the idea there is that, you're not allowed to go and intervene somewhere unless you can prove that there's a problem, right? So then that comes to the question of, okay, well, we have private currencies. What's the problem? And if you look in history, when we had private currencies issued by banks, there was a problem because if the currency went down, it would cause a ripple effect. So, my bank is healthy because we have so and so much stuff in our vaults. Okay, well, what do we have in our vaults? Well, among other things, we have a bunch of paper money that's issued by another bank. That's what keeps us healthy. So if that bank goes down, all of a sudden our bank doesn't look so healthy, and maybe we go down. And so there were these panics. And on the one hand, it's like, well, it's a financial panic. A bunch of people who had paper money lost paper money value, big deal. But it turned out those things had real consequences for, production and jobs and so on. So it wasn't possible to keep the productive economy separate from the paper money economy. All right, so that's the history. Now we go forward to Bitcoin and cryptos, and we go, well, I mean, are those things secure or not? If I have a bank and it's healthy because I have so and so many crypto coins, I've got $12 billion in Litecoin, is it healthy or not? And it's going to take a while for us to see how stable these things are. Now, personally, I feel like with the coding and protocols in place, there will always be a limited number of these things, and as long as people believe in them and use them, they'll continue to have value. So it's probably not as prone to panic as other things, but we just don't know that yet. So there is some possibility that we might want to have regulated cryptocurrencies just to kind of prevent financial panics from happening, but we don't know.
You said that with the private currencies that there were always panics, and that if one bank was unhealthy, it would have a ripple effect. But how would you say that the kind of system we have now, would you say that the kind of system we have now is healthy?
Exactly. Right. It's kind of like, what did Churchill say about democracy? It's like, it's a horrible system, but it's the best system that we have. And that's the argument that's used for the current system. So we have a single currency, we have heavily regulated banks, and a heavily regulated financial sector in general. And what happens is that sort of gives all of those institutions the incentive to look around for ways to, find loopholes in whatever the regulations are. And then, when they get in trouble, then you don't let them fail, which then encourages them next time to take more risks. So, I'm not sure this is the best way to do it. I'll just put it that way. On the other hand, I'm not sure anybody knows the best way. What I'm hoping is that some combination of artificial intelligence and kind of the spirit of the Creative Commons licensing and the open public internet, that somebody will come up with an open source, unbreakable form of monetary regulation, monetary and financial regulation. And then people can go, oh, well, that's the monetary system I want to be in. In other words, you see what I mean? That what's happening here is we're going to start having competition among different monetary systems. And it may very well be the case that the system we have now will start to look really old and antiquated and not very good. I wouldn't be surprised about that at all.
You said that maybe an open source kind of unbreakable form of regulation would maybe sprout up. What would that system do? Like what activities would it do to actually do the regulation?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think about what would be some of the typical risks to value in a currency. So in a cryptocurrency. So one risk would be that suddenly people would believe that the currency was not secure, right? That it could somehow, you could be traced or hacked or broken into. So, high security. And I think actually almost all the cryptocurrencies have met that standard. So high security. Stability in purchasing power, though, is more than just security, right? It has to react in some way to macroeconomic conditions. So the iron rule for monetary stability is that the amount of currency in the system should stay equal to the amount of transactions going on. So basically money supply and money demand being equal. And so, if you look in game economies, for example, the systems set up there, they do a pretty good job of creating monetary faucets that put money in and monetary drains that take money out that are responsive to the amount of trade going on. So you see little things like, oh, I put up magic armor on the on the auction house, and whenever I do that, there's a 3% little deposit that comes out, and then when I sell the item, I get like a little reward, and they play with those parameters so that there's more money in the system as there's more trade. It's kind of a long story how it's done, but you see what I mean? That's the kind of thing that would guarantee some value stability as well. And those are the kind of things, when I talk about AI regulators, they would do those sorts of things. Very sophisticated balancing the money supply in the system and the money demand.
Do you have like I don't want to say a real world example, because obviously we're not anywhere near that, but like, do you have any concept of how you would get like faucets to work in the real world? Or even if it's just, if we're doing most of our economic stuff, I guess, like over the line, like still, how would you work in a faucet or work a faucet that doesn't have like a game creator just running everything for us?
Well, these things are based on the amount of time it takes to solve a problem. And what if the amount of time it takes to solve a problem depends on the number of transactions ongoing in the system over the last 3 months? I don't know if any of this is technically feasible, but that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So the faucet is people mining. Well, if you make mining easier, then right, there's a lot more transactions, a lot more money demand, and make it harder when the system slows down, then you've got a money supply. Money supply increases directly tied to the changes in money demand. I mean, that's basically what the Federal Reserve is always trying to do. It's pouring through these reports, and it's trying to figure out what, how much money actually needs to be out there. And it's a completely new field. I mean, I wish I could point you to some economist who knows about this, but this there isn't one. So it's trying to invent ways for computers to mine that are responsive to economic conditions.
You also, just in your book, I just read an interesting concept of implementing faucets, which has nothing to do with an automatic faucet or a technical faucet or anything like that, but just something interesting was how you thought about, well, what if you just gave out money every time somebody drove to work, or for minor, really trivial things, just like in games. And instead of operating on a cash flow where whatever the government spends, it also has to tax back, they could just issue their own currency based on faucets and drains where they can create it or destroy it wherever they want, like it is in a game. And I thought that was pretty interesting.
Well, so at some level that the government kind of currently is doing that, but it's layered in so many different institutions and policies. But the fact is they can print money whenever they want to.
Right.
And this would just make it absolutely clear as a policy matter. And also I want to say, to any listeners who's like, man, this guy's crazy. I throw these ideas out to just kind of make readers understand this is the Wild West that we're entering. Okay, these are possibilities, very real possibilities, because these are economic systems that have worked for economies that have millions of people in them. These game economies. So let me just connect that idea of just giving money out to people for doing almost nothing to an idea that has been floating around in Europe. It's the concept of basic income, and it just sort of says, oh, you're a human being, here's money. And right now we're all like, well, we can't do that because it's going to bust the budget and blah blah blah. It's like, but listen, if we're just coining virtual money anyway, why not just instead of having welfare policy, it's like, oh, you're human, here's money. And if you want more money, well, that's kind of up to you. You've got to get beyond it. But that way we could very easily and at no cost guarantee an income floor for everyone. And, so this isn't based on merit. We're not assuming that you're good or bad or otherwise. You're just, you've got a ticking heart. And I think, there's a lot of stuff that gets opened up when you unburden the currency. And it's not just for people to go and, launder money or something. This also can free up lots of, agencies of the government, lots of corporations, private foundations, universities. it's free money frees up a lot of stuff.
You said a second ago that, how the government's just making virtual money anyway, so who cares? Can you tell us about the lines between virtual money and real money and how sometimes they're blurred and sometimes they're non-existent or completely reversed?
Well, I mean, the very first thing I'd like to say is we have to understand the dollar bills in our pockets as virtual money. Just are, And what makes them virtual is the fact that they're pieces of paper that can't be traded under law for gold. You can't go and get a bunch of gold for the dollars. They're just pieces of paper. The only reason they work is because of a pretty metaphysical, intangible thing called shared expectations. Right? The reason I can give $1 to someone at the store and they give me a Diet Coke is because they expect to be able to take that dollar and give it to somebody else in return for something real. Now, it is true the government is involved in sustaining that expectation, but at its heart, it's just an expectation. And there are historical examples of entire countries, entire populations deciding, wow, this paper money isn't worth anything. So like the hyperinflation in Germany in the early 20s. So, we can't just sort of sit tight and say, well, the dollar's real and bitcoins are virtual. No, I mean, at some level, everything that's money the money part of it is virtual. So then, okay, you asked about lines, and you see the line between the so-called virtual and the so-called real being crossed every time someone uses essentially valueless money in order to buy something that's really worth having. So when I spend my dollar for a Diet Coke, I'm crossing the line between the virtual and the real. But I think what most people think about is like if someone trades dollars for bitcoins. And it's not that they're really crossing the virtual to real. Instead, what they're doing is they're all of a sudden understanding how virtual the dollar is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sort of discussion occupied quite a bit of the beginning of your book, and I thought that was just fascinating that, that's something people need to realize is that dollars really have no backing anymore. They have, even as paper, they're hardly usable to write on or anything like that. So, yeah, you can't eat it either. So, well, this is backing up a little bit, but we talked quite a bit about regulation, and a couple times you said how the amount of money in circulation has to sort of match the amount of trade going on. And I think that basically translates to inflation because generally you expect growth. And that's probably somewhere where we have a fairly significant disagreement. So I guess I'll just say it straight out. Well, first of all, is that true? Do you generally agree that a currency should be or should cause inflation, I guess? And then secondly, I guess just why?
Well, let's see. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a mass psychology thing in here. I think, and again, I'm not a macroeconomist, so anybody who's like a Keynesian economist or a Friedman von Hayek economist is going to be screaming and shouting, saying, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a game economist. But the Keynesian essence, as I understand it, is basically a psychology thing. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with economic theory. It's the notion that having money a little bit loose, in a way, almost tricks people into believing in economic growth, which then gets them to do things that create economic growth. Right? That in my time of teaching from macroeconomics principles books, that's what I really picked up about Keynesianism. That there's a need to grease the wheel, and if you believe that, okay, then you think inflation is kind of good so long as people don't notice it, right? Because you put money out there and people kind of go, whoa, I got extra demand for my products, so I better go put another order in at the factory. And down at the factory, they're like, hey, they need more of our stuff. We better hire more workers. So they go to the workers and they hire more workers, and the workers go out in the world saying, hey, we got a new job. Let's go spend some money. See, so it's this kind of self-confirming log rolling situation. And, okay, well, that would argue for some inflation. Now, on the other hand, when people notice inflation, right, what do they start doing? They start writing contracts saying, okay, this will be $100,000, but make it $109,000 because we know that inflation is going to eat away a bunch of this stuff. And so then that whole psychological trick just doesn't work because people anticipate it. So that's all theory. In practice, you'll notice that most economies and most people running economies seem to be happiest combining both economic and political and psychological factors when the inflation rate is, 2 to 5%, something small. You look at all the game companies, right? Their inflation rates, they're happiest when there's, not deflation, but just a little bit of growth. So I put all that reasoning together and that empirical stuff, and I'm like, that's probably a good thing. So I'm guessing you're saying, why should it inflate at all? Why not just have a certain amount of money and be done with it, right?
Yeah, that's how Bitcoin is supposed to work. To me, the reason I would prefer that is because then I always know that, if there's 21 million Bitcoins, I know that I always have 1/21 millionth of everything. For me, it's just a way, I guess, to really know what's going on. It seems more maybe organic, more legitimate for there just to be a certain amount, and that's just the way it is. Whereas I guess it's different with the government printing money because there's someone controlling that, and that, I don't like that at all because they could make bad decisions. They could, whether intentionally or unintentionally, they could screw things up. Your idea of an automatic sort of technological, open source, unbreakable regulator sounds better to me, but even then, I think I would still prefer just a set number, and that's the way things are. So, I don't know.
Well, no, I can see that. Because here's, there's a very honored economic and theoretical tradition around what you just said, which is what's called monetarism. So when I was coming of age in economics in the 1980s, there was tremendous debate about the strategy I just talked about, this kind of low acceptable inflation strategy. And the alternative makes a lot of sense, which is the economy will adapt to the amount of money that's out there. And so the best way to stabilize the economy is just to be very, very clear. This is the amount of money. It's going to be growing at a fixed rate, and that's that. It is not going to respond to various pressures out there. And the thinking behind that was that this concept of lags in policy, and here's the idea. It's like, oh, the economy is slowing down. We'd better use monetary policy to pump it up again. And it takes so long for that to actually have an impact that by the time you're actually stoking the economy, it's growing again, and then you're basically over-stoking it. And then you're like, oh my gosh, it's going too fast. So, we've got to do something now to cut back on the money supply to slow it down. Well, by the time that has the effect, the economy's already slowing down of its own, and all you're doing is dampening it. So you're just making the amplitude of the cycles worse. And the monetarist recommendation is like, just do no harm. Just set up the money and don't mess with it. And that really worked well for the decades following. It caused a recession when it first started in the early 80s. But that was because the undercard of the economy had gotten out of control. So you undergo a recession to get things under control, and then, hey, things were very, very stable for a nice long period of time. So I think there's a lot to recommend that. So that would sort of say, like, instead of Bitcoin slowing down and then running out of money, or not running out of money, but slowing down and just coming to a cap, what if they could just fix the rate at which the Bitcoin economy was going to grow? Either one of those things would have the benefits that you're talking about, which is that people would just know what's going on, and it would be very stable, and the economy could just react to what's there.
I'm still just thinking about, I keep going back to the, having an open source thing to control it, where I don't, have a problem as much with, something, or someone, I guess, governing an economy in a perfect world, or if it's somehow you could design a completely unbiased program or protocol to do it. It's just any time where you get into the Keynesian stuff where you're having people try to pick to do it, and you start running into problems because either they can make mistakes or they could do it right, but it then depends on, you're making the money, but you can't just, at least, not back then. Maybe you could figure out a way to do it in the future, but if that thing's gonna work, it has to be, I don't even know if it would work better then, but the way they're saying it, they make it sound sometimes like, oh, we just print this money and it just goes to the exact right people, but the way it works is it normally with that trickle down thing, where you give the money to the people at the top, and then they're supposed to create more jobs, but then by the time we get it, that's whenever it's the really, like, the inflation part is hit in.
Well, I think, you're just sort of saying, I don't trust any human system to be perfect in that way, or not even perfect, effective in that way. And there you're sort of going back to the founding fathers, right? Because that was absolutely what motivated them. They said, look, we can sit around here all day and come up with 1 million perfect governments, so long as you rely on the goodwill of the people who are running the offices.
Right.
Yeah.
What's possible, though, if you say, look, we cannot count on people to have goodwill, so we always have to look at the worst case scenario. We have to think about what happens if there's just, some really rotten actor in one part of the government, and that's why they came up with checks and balances. So I think that it makes perfect sense. Can we design a system that is really impervious to human weakness at the administrative level? And so my hope is not really doesn't come from understanding coding or anything. It comes from understanding competition. That is the idea that if you have 1 million currencies competing with one another, chances are good that somebody's going to come up with a system that really does survive against all the awful things that human beings can throw at it. And people will learn about it and they will flock to it. Maybe I'm kind of Pollyannish by believing that. And also, I'm not saying this is going to be tomorrow. It might be 50 years. But, I do have some faith in the ability of human beings just throwing stuff out there and then voting with their feet to bring about positive.
Yeah, maybe I'm Pollyannish with you as well. I don't think I've ever used that phrase before, though, but at that point, it's not even like a thing of like a person doing the right thing. It's just whatever system is going to be the best for the biggest amount of people, they're probably going to go there. I don't have any problem with even the system that we have today if I was allowed to not be involved in that with my taxes. Like, if I was just given, like, yeah, okay, you can either use this or you can use Bitcoin, you can use a bunch of other things. I think that the best stuff would rise to the top, I guess would be the phrase there. So, yeah, that'd be great if we were able to have, like, an actual open competitive market for that.
That's what I think is happening. I don't think anybody can stop that. I think, Bitcoin is being challenged on a number of fronts, and that's healthy. Anytime you see something like that, that's all to the good. It's cool too because Bitcoin again isn't owned by anybody. It's not like, oh, some people are going to lose their jobs if Bitcoin turns out not to be the most important thing. It's like, no, people will just transfer their value to another currency, and eventually the Facebook will arrive, the one that's the really good one.
Right. Yeah, that's something we talk about a lot on the show. We haven't really chosen any specific altcoins yet because there's so many out there and a lot of them don't really offer much benefits or they're hardly any different than Bitcoin. But in a general way, we definitely encourage and support altcoins for that exact reason, just because they're a way to compete. It's currency competition. And so the best one is probably out there somewhere. And yeah, it will emerge. And we think that's great.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's just, there's going to be a lot of disruption. Some people are very uncomfortable with any kind of economic disruption, but I think we have to get ourselves ready for that. And that, maybe the wisest thing is to have assets in multiple different types of currency, including the dollar and the yen and the euro. Because we're entering a period of currency uncertainty.
Absolutely. I want to bring up kind of a different subject, but something that definitely interested me in the book. You spoke quite a bit about whether or not it was legal to have your own currency, to issue your own currency. And again, this spans everywhere from Facebook credits to World of Warcraft gold and things like that. So can you tell us what you found in that sort of research about what's okay and what's not okay?
Well, it seems like the only thing that's not okay is to make a form of currency and make it look like U.S. money. So counterfeiting is against the rules. But there's absolutely no legal barrier to creating an entity and calling it money and using it to do transactions. Right? The act in itself is totally legal. Now, depending on what the IRS says, there could be a tax burden, but there's no reason why anyone couldn't do it. And lots of Americans over the last 200 years have made their own currencies and have not been prosecuted. So, there's been community money. There was farmer money, because in the 19th century the dollars bought too much money. Back in the 19th century, a dollar was like, $500 today, and that was like the only currency going around. And people couldn't actually trade for smaller things. So these farmers would invent their own money. I mean, I have coins here from the 30s when, there was, it was a big depression and it was really, money was hard to come by. And people who owned stores would just create, here's our coin. Go out and you can use this. We pay our workers in our own little coin, and then they can use it in the store. And so it's not there isn't any legal barrier at all.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just want to bring up the only significant case that you brought up was, like you said, making money that looked like normal currency, and that was with the Liberty Dollar operation, and that's something we've mentioned on the show, and it's something that I think people should at least look into, see what happened there and what was going on, and it's important for anyone into gold or silver too.
This episode of You, Me, and BTC is brought to you in part by the Canacoin Project, an online decentralized peer-to-peer cryptocurrency for the cannabis industry. Canacoin is designed to meet the standards of the continually growing marijuana legalization movement and was built upon the success of the Bitcoin and Litecoin protocols. We have not only implemented a more faster, efficient network for users to transact, we finally created a cryptocurrency that can be backed by one of the world's largest commodities, the cannabis plant. To get started today, or for more information on how to get involved in the Canacoin project, please find us at www.canacoin.cc or contact the development team via email at team@canacoin.cc. We also encourage users to participate in the discussion and follow our thread over on the Bitcoin Talk Alternative Cryptocurrencies forum. And we also encourage users to subscribe to r/Canacoin on Reddit and follow us at CCN Project on Twitter for more information. And now, let's get back to Tim, Daniel, and John with the You, Me, and BTC podcast.
So let's move in a little bit. Like you said a bit ago, that you're a game economist first and foremost, and that was one of the most interesting things to me about reading the book, and I watched a couple videos on YouTube. I think it's amazing. I like games too, and I think it's cool that you've been so involved and you've been able to study them and everything. So can you tell us what all you've learned from games, how you've applied game economics, and just, tell us how the real virtual worlds, that's an oxymoron, I guess, but tell us about how you've used them and things like that.
Well, I mean, I suppose the most important thing I've learned from game worlds is that they're a mirror of reality. And you can have like cultural studies people come in and talk about, Plato and the shadows on the cave wall and all this stuff. That's all philosophy. I'm not a philosopher. I am an economist, though. And so, in economics, we have a thing called the subjective theory of value, which is that things have value if people value them. So, boy, when you have that kind of a perspective and you look at what goes on in games, and then you go to I'm trying to think some of the sillier things that people get into. Some people collect encyclopedias. And go to sporting events, and it's considered very, very important. And you realize, there isn't that much of a difference between the game world and the real world. I mean, let's take politics, for example. I mean, there's a lot of people who kind of, when they learn enough about politics, they say, it kind of doesn't matter who we vote for. It kind of ends up being very, very similar. No matter, and then there's all this stuff made up to talk about, the other side of the enemy, and it's the end of the world. And, it turns out that, Obama does the same thing Bush would have done in a number of areas. And so, you start thinking, gosh, maybe society is kind of a game. And then you go and you read your Shakespeare and you realize, boy, people have been saying this for a long time. And so when I sort of got all that in my head, I thought, well, games are a really cool place to look at realities that are in formation, in a sense. The games are kind of like petri dishes for what might be possible on the outside, because if you think about it, if you send in a bunch of kids to go chase a dragon, the dragon isn't real, but boy, the teamwork is.
Yeah.
Doing real teamwork. So, and so I kind of take it on myself. Part of my job is to go to so-called serious people and get them to respect the kind of worlds that are being built in fantasy, because they do represent genuine longings of genuine people that we ought to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's awesome that you've studied all that. And Tim and I were talking the other day, it's difficult, maybe, to be sure how, I don't know, it's hard to say how directly maybe the economic things that you learn in games can apply to the real world, just because it is a different place and it has a different purpose, which is something you talk about quite a bit. So it's hard to know exactly how it relates to the real world, just because it is different in several ways, but that doesn't mean that it's not related or that it's not helpful or anything like that. I guess you just have to see what drives people and how everything works, and I guess that's kind of what you do, right?
Yeah, it being an academic, all I need to do is find a problem. I don't have to find the solution. I need to find problems and explain to people, this is real. This is here I am using the word real again. These are significant issues. This stuff is important, and our world will be better off if we put some effort into thinking about them and trying to do something about these issues. So I feel like that's most of the work that I'm supposed to be doing is saying things like that. And it's like, with a few slides and a few phrases, you get people who kind of furrow their brow and shake their head. I'm sure you guys get this, talking about Bitcoin to family and friends. They're like, that's what I'm doing. And so I'm always interested in talking to folks like you who are trying to explain to people what is on the horizon. It's a difficult skill.
Yeah. Just to make clear, Daniel, my point about the difficulty of using the stuff from like a game economy was that the person, it makes a lot more sense now that you said that, you're not looking as much for a solution, you're just more pointing out more problems and then maybe possible solutions, and you can kind of mess around with it. My difficulty with that was just, if people then take that and go, oh, well then this is all we have to do in the real world, is because with the game thing, I see that no matter how much some people in government or some government supporters might want us to think of them as altruistic gods, basically, with a game developer, you're coming at it from really like you're creating the entire world. You're creating the rules in that world, at least as far as I have no idea how to develop a game, but where in this real world, now, you can have all the control you want over a person, but you still can't control their, you can't control their thoughts if they're player versus player games, but I think there's a lot more control there. But I definitely like that what you said, Mr. Castronova, about really just using it to find problems in it, because you can basically just set it up, let it run, see how people work, as long as you're not so focused on saying, well, we need to use this now, and I know the solution now to all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like the model of science. It's a thing people at universities love to say. We need more research on this. It means more money for me. I'm honest when I say that. I really do think that it's going to suck for the world when it gets blindsided by the kind of stuff that comes out of games. I mean, the social networks, for example, were the first big bunch of that. People in the year 2000, 2001 were spending all kinds of time in the games, chatting with one another, sharing tidbits, news, and information. And somebody just went into the game and peeled out that part and made software that did just that. And everyone went, revolution! And now it's happening with the currencies made in games. And, there are other things coming out, like the idea of mission. People go in and play these games because they feel like there's something they can actually do. They can have an effect on something. They can be effective. And, there's obviously a lot of hunger for that. And, somebody's going to tap into that and create movements out of it, actual movements in the real world by giving people this sense of mission. And those can be good and those can be bad, right? So, but I would prefer if we stop sort of getting blindsided by this, but instead have a lot of people with white hair who understand games and understand what's going on there and aren't completely surprised.
Actually, before I forget this, I remember I was watching your speech at your TED Talk. It was the 9-minute version. I'm not sure if there's any longer one, but
boring one.
I didn't find it too boring. I mean, yeah, but I guess I'm just asking, what kind of games are you talking about specifically, or I don't know, even if for some of our listeners, what kind of games would you recommend? Because you talk about why we should all be gamers, but I think obviously you can have some games where it's more geared to what you're talking about problem solving and teamwork, compared to other ones which are a little bit less, less in depth. That you
I'm not going to sit here and say everyone needs to play Angry Birds at least, but here's my deal, right? There are people who spend incredible amounts of time to make sure that they know all the right movies, and they've listened to all the right, jazz music, or they've been to the right museums. And you know what? If you're going to understand this form, you don't want to know it in the form of Angry Birds, right? You want to know the deep ones, the ones that are hard. And I teach this to students, and you wouldn't believe, the students look at me the first time I give them a kind of a deep game, and they're like, I don't like playing games. It's like, yeah, I know, but your English professor tells you you're not going to like Shakespeare, but you don't bat an eye. You're like, okay, I got to learn how Shakespeare goes. But there's this real resistance to going deep into a game, and I think people should overcome that. So to go deep into, I'm trying to think of easy ways to get into a deep game. Well, World of Warcraft is a massively multiplayer online world that's really easy to get into, and pretty quickly you'll start to see the kind of mind-blowing things that happen when you put 10 million people together in an environment. I mean, it's so that's certainly a big recommendation. Some of these things are hard because you need a decent computer to play them, so there's that. But there are these tremendous simulation games like Hearts of Iron and Crusader Kings 2 that, there's a field of scientific inquiry called agent-based modeling, where you create these little agents and they run around in an atmosphere and they eat up sugar and then they reproduce and then birds come and eat them, and it's like this very Tinker Toy thing. And here's some company in Sweden has replicated a medieval society of tens of thousands of individuals, each one with its own AI, reacting to things like, how threatened am I from the neighborhood duchy? Do I love the daughter of my king? What do I feel about people who don't have my religion? Yeah, and it works, and it actually replicates and it simulates what those kinds of relationships, all these weird alliances going on. I mean, it's crazy. And again, it's one of those things like, I'm not expecting people to play that game and come away with some answer, some deep insight about medieval history. But I do expect them to have their mind blown by what's possible when you start creating these systems.
I think I can definitely understand some of that resistance you talked about, and I think I would request if you ever get your time machine fixed, could you go back maybe 10 or 15 years and tell that to my mom so she'll let me play more video games? That would be great.
The debates I have with my own boys are not really, what are you doing sitting there, at the computer playing those games? It's like, they'll sit down on the PC and they'll be playing Minecraft. And I'm like, thumbs up. But then they start watching Minecraft videos. What are you doing watching a video? That's passive entertainment. To heck with that. Get in there and make some. So, and I think you have parents today who understand the difference between good rock and roll and bad rock and roll. You didn't have that in the 60s, right? So, parents can go to their kids and say, that's crap. This is good. Listen to this. And, okay, whatever. You can go listen to that. But really, I'm telling you, kid, this is why this band is better than that. Well, we need to have people able to do that with games. I talk to people my age, I'm 51, and all they ever say is, oh, I know, my nephew's always playing those games. I look over his shoulder, and they don't know the difference between a completely schlocky first-person shooter and something that has depth and story and emotions, So that we need to improve the literacy of people in general around these games.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hey, there's probably just one or two more things I want to touch on. This is something, I'm going to call it page 162, and it's one of the, you mentioned Bitcoin in passing here and there, but this is the first time you bring it up a little bit more in depth. You give it a paragraph or two, and, I love you and I love the book, but I'm not going to lie, it probably hurt a little bit reading this because I guess I should ask, has anybody spoken to you about this yet? Because I feel like if anybody knows anything about Bitcoin and reads this, they would. So I guess before I go off on this, has anybody spoken to you about this?
No, but as I was writing it, I just know, sometimes if you make a sharp point, you're going to...
Well, see, the thing is, I would argue it's not even really a matter of opinion or anything like that. It's pretty much a matter of fact. So I'm just going to read the quote here. Bitcoin mining problems have been set up so they get harder and harder every year. That would be the first issue, is that they don't have to get harder. They have been getting harder because more people have been mining, but they could get easier too. It's self-adjusting, and it adjusts based on the number of miners. So it could go up or down, and then you continue with the result that sometime in the mid-21st century, every Bitcoin that computers can conceivably mine will have been mined. Skip a little bit. It operates such that the mining problems of the year 2050 would require a computer the size of the entire universe operating at the speed of light. The day will therefore come when no more Bitcoins will appear. So, just a little bit of constructive criticism, because it is self-adjusting. It won't continue to increase as it has. It'll increase pretty closely with the amount of mining power. So unless there are computers that actually exist that are that big and that powerful, that's the only way the difficulty could go up that high. But in reality, it self-adjusts such that a block is found roughly every 10 minutes. And that, I think it adjusts every 2 weeks or so. And so just thought I'd throw that out there.
Important. I mean, because what I get caught up in, since I'm not a technology person myself, I take on faith this idea that the number of Bitcoins available is fixed, right? I look at the chart, and they have, this logarithmic chart where the number of Bitcoins in circulation goes asymptotic to some certain fixed number. And I'm like, okay, how do I explain that to people who don't know anything about any of this, given that I'm foggy on it myself? So it sounds like I got some things wrong.
Well, that is actually still true. There's only going to be 21 million roughly ever, and the reason for that is because I think it's 3 or 4 years or so, the reward that you get from mining, it's not because mining gets more difficult, but the reward gets cut in half every few years. So eventually the reward will go down either to zero or just to a negligible number. And so that's when we'll hit the cap of 21 million. So
if I get interviewed again, I want to make sure I get this right. The experts tell me that it's not the difficulty that's going up. Difficulty is adjusting to the amount of computing power that is out there. But the reward that people can get for solving a problem is designed to get smaller and smaller.
Exactly. Yep, that's exactly right.
Thank you very much for sharing that.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. And
is the reward a time thing, Daniel? Like, is that based off of years, or is that still based off of the hash?
Technically, it's not based on years because it's based on the number of blocks. But with fairly little variance, a block is supposed to be found every 10 minutes roughly. Yeah. So technically, it's not based on years, but because for the most part blocks are found every 10 minutes, you can say it's going to take about this many years until the reward gets cut in half. So, well. We are almost done. The last thing I want to do, Mr. Castronova, which we try to do with as many guests as we remember to, I want to ask you if you have any interesting personal stories, kind of anything unique that, that really happened in your life, anything that taught you something, or we've had some guests that have met some pretty famous or infamous people. Normally I ask about in the Bitcoin space, but I'll ask you, anything in economics, in virtual gaming, anything like that. Are there any really cool kind of personal stories that you could share with us?
Well, I mean, this has to do, I guess, with the overall politics of this area. I'm really enthusiastic about games and the power of fantasy and metaphysics to change the real world. And there's a pretty specific reason for that, and that is because for most of my life, I perceive my own life as being really, really not good. And so what really struck me in a personal way is when I read the stories of J.R.R. Tolkien's life. Okay, Tolkien is the inventor of Middle-earth, and he's kind of the number one fantasist of the 20th century, with influence over this area that's just incredible. And he was an orphan. He was in World War I. I mean, his early life was horrible. And then, he goes and writes all this fantasy stuff. And he got lots of criticism for it from his colleagues. But he wrote persuasive essays about how, listen, when people grow up in a prison, you can't blame them for trying to get out and go home.
Right.
That has really resonated for me. Setting all the economic stuff aside, this idea that we human beings are not supposed to live the way that we are living right now. And that's some would say that's a permanent part of our condition. That we're fallen, But, we're living in a modern world that has done a lot of good for our teeth and our health and everything. But I see a wasteland of sadness out there. The things that made Tolkien sad are still making us sad today. Right, which is, it's things like relationships and love and family. And so I'm really motivated by the game space because I think it's being very critical of the kind of, cubicle, traffic jam lifestyles. And we tell people, oh, this is the great way to live. This is the best. Is this really all we could come up with all this money? Was to sit in cubicles and be caught in traffic for 4 hours? I mean, there's something deeply, deeply wrong with our world today, and that's what motivates me to keep in the game space.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, and Tim and I actually took a fantasy literature class together once. We were 2 out of the 3 people in the class, and that we definitely loved the class, and yeah, Tolkien's definitely extremely important to us, and we went through some of those essays too, so yeah, we think that's great. So, well, hey, this was Edward Castronova. He wrote Wildcat Currency, which is a really awesome book about all sorts of virtual currencies, or maybe not so virtual currencies that are starting to fly around the world, and definitely encourage everyone to check that out. Mr. Castronova, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a blast.
Thanks, Tad.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tad.
Is there anything else you'd wanna plug on here? Like any other further resources anyone can get on you?
Well, I mean, they can just go to my website, but the thing I'm really most excited about is my university is going to launch a game design program where we can start, having students really get into this stuff from an early stage. So if you have any people who are, 16, 17, 18, and are thinking about going to college, they should come to Indiana. We're going to have the best program in the world.
That's awesome. Yeah, check that out. What's your website?
Just Google my name. It's like the top 2 or 3 links. It's like one of these university ones. So.
Sure. All right, yep, Edward Castronova. Well, thanks again.
Yep,
right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to episode 25. All of the music in today's show was from Jon Stewart. We look forward to broadcasting from the Bitcoin in the Beltway conference next week. And we're especially grateful to our sponsors, API Coin and Monero, for getting us there. See you next week.